Cohen. I'm Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this afternoon for this lecture by Khalil Gibran Muhammad. First, I want to tell you a few words about Radcliffe. At Radcliffe, we bring together scholars and scientists and artists who break new ground within their own fields, but more importantly, who cross disciplinary boundaries to make an impact that transcends any one subject area. And we are dedicated to sharing the fruits of their work with broad public audiences in person, like today, and online. Each year, for example, we host our annual gender conference, in which we examine an important topic through the lens of gender. This year's gender conference is called Ways with Words, Exploring Language and Gender. Radcliffe is an intellectual community dedicated to inquiry and to action, with its own preeminent research library, the Schlesinger. These qualities make Radcliffe the ideal place to host a lecture by Khalil Muhammad, who is a scholar, a public figure, and the current director of another major research library. We often hear about the elusive figure of the public intellectual. And even more often, we hear laments about the disappearance of the public intellectual. But Khalil actually is one. And last I checked, he is still here, alive and kicking. He currently directs the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture at the New York Public Library, one of the leading research facilities dedicated to the study of the African diaspora. He is also an historian and a visiting professor at the City University of New York. And before that, he was a professor of history at Indiana University. Moreover, Khalil is a public intellectual you will be seeing around these parts more often in the future, because he will be joining the Harvard community next year as professor of history, race, and public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and as a Suzanne Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute. We are very grateful to Sue Murray, who's sitting over here, for her generous and enthusiastic support of Radcliffe's mission, and I am so pleased that she could be with us here tonight to welcome Khalil. Radcliffe professors are distinguished scholars recruited to Harvard with a very special invitation to join a home school as well and be a Harvard faculty member there and to participate in Radcliffe's unique interdisciplinary community. In Khalil's case, the Suzanne Young Murray Professorship will help him return to intensive immersion in archival research and scholarship after a number of years serving as intellectual leader and administrator of the Schomburg Center. Khalil will now have the opportunity to return to research in manuscript collections after working so hard to collect and preserve them. And I have to say that as an historian myself, in my 5th year as Radcliffe Dean, I'm pretty jealous. We hope that while Khalil is here at Radcliffe, which he'll actually be here next year, he will draw on the unsurpassed staff and resources of our own Schlesinger Library in doing his research. Throughout his career, Khalil has brought scholarship and public policy together. He regularly turns an historian's sharp eye and sensitive ear to major issues of our day. His first book, The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, examines how sociologists in the early 20th century worked to shift explanations for crime away from innate biology and toward economic and cultural factors. But their efforts backfired for African Americans because they resulted in widespread association of Black culture with criminality. That stereotyping, in turn, made it easier for whites to perpetuate racism and systematically deny rights to Black Americans. The Condemnation of Blackness won critical acclaim, a wide public audience, and the 2011 John Hope Franklin Best Book Award in American Studies. Its relevance today is obvious. In recent months, daily headlines have transported us from the streets of Ferguson, Missouri and Cleveland, Ohio, into the cell blocks of Waller County, Texas. We have encountered movements like Black Lives Matter, and we've watched protests unfold from city blocks to college campuses. Khalil's deep research into how ideas about race and crime circumscribe opportunities for African Americans is both timely and timelessly important. Khalil also helps us attend to some of our own specific priorities right here in Radcliffe Yard. In fact, even before the Radcliffe professorship arose, Jane Kamensky, our new Pforzheimer faculty director of the Schlesinger Library and a professor of history at Harvard, had identified Khalil as someone uniquely equipped to help us with our goal of diversifying the Schlesinger Library's manuscript holdings to ensure that they document a wide-ranging history of women and gender in America. With that aim in mind, Jane invited Khalil to come and consult on building our collections and to deliver this lecture today. So, when Khalil accepted Harvard and Radcliffe's offer to join us as a professor, we had the good fortune of having already scheduled this visit. Thus, today has become a kind of welcome to what I hope will be Khalil's long and happy career at Harvard. I could not be more pleased. So now I'll turn things over to Jane. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me add my welcome to Liz's and to share with you the Schlesinger Library's tremendous sense of excitement and pride in hosting Dr. Khalil Muhammad here this afternoon. I'm keenly aware that my remarks are now all that stand between you and his talk, so I'll be brief. I want to concentrate on an aspect of Muhammad's profile that we mustn't lose sight of as we celebrate his many other striking accomplishments, and that's his librarianship, or to be more precise, his work as director since mid-2011 of the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And I'm going to use the word transformative a lot, which is a kind of term of art in the academy, often overused, and in this case, actually true. So Liz has given you a little of the backstory here, that early last fall, right after I got to Schlesinger, we invited Khalil to visit Radcliffe this winter and did so in utter ignorance that he would soon become our colleague. Many of my best ideas are done in utter ignorance. Our invitation was part of an ongoing process of strategic planning to widen the diversity and deepen the inclusiveness of our archival holdings, a process that my wonderful colleagues had set in motion about 3 years before I showed up to take credit for it. That planning got an infusion of energy and expertise from a conference in October 2014 that Khalil put together at Schomburg called the State of Black Research Collections. That gathering investigated the crucial role that institutions collecting African American and African diasporic materials play in the future of the humanities, as well as the extraordinary pressures on such institutions today and creative solutions to fight against those pressures. That conference connected two of my Schlesinger colleagues to two stellar curators, one from Spelman and one from the Library Company of Philadelphia, who have since come to Cambridge to share their strategic acumen with us. So Khalil's visit to Schlesinger yesterday and earlier today, we've been now running him hard for 36 hours, is in many ways the capstone of a project that he himself catalyzed through his work at Schomburg. As you've heard from Liz, and we'll hear again in a few minutes, Muhammad's major scholarly work has centered on the relationship between quantitative and racial, indeed racist, regimes of thought and policy. His prize-winning 2010 book, Condemnation of Blackness, documents the pernicious uses of statistical methods and claims to create a discourse of black criminality, a language that emerged in the half-century after 1890 and that we continue to live inside today. As you know, Khalil's topic for this afternoon is how numbers lie. So it is with some trepidation that I want to give you the story of his leadership at Schomburg by the numbers. He has raised the library's profile through a social media strategy that includes Twitter feeds with a combined 25,000 followers and a Facebook community over 45,000 strong. He has seeded a substantial increase in media coverage of the center's work from, by LexisNexis, 331 newspaper articles mentioning Schomburg between 2005 and 2010, to 481 since he took the helm in mid-2011, a growth rate of nearly 50%, which does not include, by the way, last week's gorgeous New Yorker cover titled Schomburg Center, Harlem, New York. In the crucial realm of donor support, Khalil maintained Schomburg's enduring relationship with Ford and Rockefeller and New York City and other important funders while bringing in new resources from foundations and individuals, including Schomburg's largest ever individual donation, a $2.5 million gift from Ruth and Sidney Lapidus to establish and endow the Lapidus Center for the Historical Analysis of Transatlantic Slavery. Overall, he increased fundraising enough that he could grow an annual budget to nearly twice the size of the one that he inherited. Khalil brought the community into the center and has taken the center even deeper into its community. Under his leadership, Schomburg has experienced a 26% increase in overall attendance in the last 3 years and a 39% increase in program attendance. He has spearheaded a $22 million renovation project, which will break ground just as he's leaving and will serve as a monument to his directorship for decades to come. All of this as a denominator over less than 5 years. These numbers, I submit, don't lie. Of course, they also don't tell the whole story. Muhammad's phenomenal success as director of the Schomburg is a product of expansive vision and relentless energy, and truly, I'm exhausted by just a day and a half with the man. Under his leadership, the center has held pioneering exhibitions on topics ranging from Black gay life to the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington to the Obama presidency. He has innovated in public programming in the arts, politics, and popular culture, as well as continuing to promote scholarly research. Recent Schomburg events have featured speakers as diverse as Timbaland and Eric Foner, and topics ranging from marronage in the 18th and 19th century Caribbean to the life of radical Black feminist Florence Flo Kennedy, whose papers, if you'll forgive me a plug here, the Schlesinger holds. Over the last 2 days alone, while he's visiting with us at Radcliffe, Khalil has missed lectures on Black conservatism by our colleague Leah Wright-Rigueur, and the premiere of Dapline, a choreographic collaboration centered on the Dap as a conduit for Black identity, solidarity, and history. Among many other aspects of his innovative programming, Khalil has raised the profile of women, gender, and sexuality among a menu of topics that I think had traditionally skewed somewhat less intersectionally and somewhat more heroically male. Equally significant as these marquee public events, which feature regularly in the Times Society pages, are the programs Muhammad Schomburg undertakes with New York City school children, from kindergarten through college. This includes not just class visits, but dedicated calendar spaces like the Junior Scholars Initiative, which brings high schoolers interested in Black history and culture to the Schomburg on Saturday mornings for a long program, thus undertaking the crucial work of sustaining Black history and building the pipeline of scholars of color from the pre-collegiate level upwards. In all of these ways, Muhammad has forged the Schomburg into a very rare kind of powerhouse, an institution that hones the cutting edge of research by supporting advanced study at the very highest level and by nourishing deep, sustained community engagement. I will not win any friends here today by admitting that my first response, when I heard that Khalil had accepted the offer to join us at Harvard, was to feel just a little bit guilty. I quote the Amsterdam News, the great Harlem newspaper from last December. In recent weeks, the Harlem community has been stunned by a series of shocks in which Muhammad's announced departure figured as the latest and perhaps the gravest of several. But as Khalil told that reporter, he leaves the Schomburg far stronger than he found it, and perhaps most important to us, he's bringing the center's agenda to Cambridge, where he will continue to forge the model of the public intellectual as community-engaged scholar who demonstrates that the cutting edge and the neighborhood are closer together than we often think. I feel so privileged to live and work in Khalil Muhammad's intellectual and institutional neighborhood now, and I'm delighted to welcome him to Radcliffe, not just today, but for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. I am totally embarrassed and entirely grateful for the very warm and gracious welcome. I really appreciate that. To Dean Cohen, thank you for your leadership here. As I've said to many people since we've gotten to know each other, that one of the first books that I read was her first book, and I've forgotten the name. Making the New Deal, that's right. I always remember the term welfare capitalism and these parlor immigrants who were surrounded themselves with the accoutrements of the bourgeois, which was groundbreaking in its way of disrupting the usual bromides of labor history and social history. So it made a difference. And to be here in this moment, to be part of this community and to be able to be part of her leadership is very special to me. I also want to say to Sue Murray, thank you very much for your generosity as a donor to the Radcliffe Institute. I know how important it is for these institutions to depend on generous people, and I am grateful that I benefit from your generosity. To my colleagues in the library world, to Marilyn Dunn and her leadership at the Schlesinger Library, you've done a magnificent job over the past 10 years. You have an amazing staff of people, and I know that Jane appreciates having great morale and a team of people who work really hard. In all the ways that Jane described the Schomburg Center's success by the numbers, which I appreciate the dig. Partly what I will say, I will explain lying. I have all sorts of disclaimers, right? But I got you here in the audience. But to the extent that I get to take any credit for what has happened at the Schomburg Center, I take credit because people show up to work every day and are passionate and committed to an institution that's 90 years old. And we carry forward the responsibility that we inherit, and we try to do the best that we can to inspire others so that one day they get to step into those shoes as well. And I certainly got that spirit with regard to your leadership at the Schlesinger Library. I see a number of colleagues at the Kennedy School, and at the risk of leaving anyone out, I'll just say thank you very much for being here. Thank you for selecting me to be at the school, to be a colleague of yours, to the graduate students, some of whom I saw earlier, and to so many others who I am meeting for the first time. Even if I'm up here and you're out there, I hope that we get a chance to talk later. I see Alex. Thanks, Alex, for coming. And finally, to family and friends. There are old friends and new friends here in the audience. The person who taught me how to make blueberry pancakes as a 9-year-old is literally in the room. So this feels very special to me. Well, anyone who's heard me lecture on my book, and you heard all those great things that I did at Schomburg, so you'll bear with me that I am mostly delivering a lecture here inspired by the condemnation of blackness. The great part about the book for me is that it makes a lot of different arguments and works with a lot of primary material. And it's always in conversation with the present, sometimes attenuated, sometimes very directly. But nevertheless, I'm still inspired to talk about it. So if you've heard me talk about the condemnation of blackness before, you might get something new today. And if not, well, thank you for showing up anyhow. The last thing I'll say as a disclaimer, I'm happy to talk about the scholarly inspiration, the literature review that inspired this work during Q&A if you're interested, but I won't roll it back in the way that I might before a scholarly audience. I think we've got a pretty mixed crowd here. And lastly, there's a lot of text. I have played with presentation over the years, and one of the things that I find is that rather than reading either complicated thoughts and showing you an image to go along with it, I think that people can stew with the words. Words matter, ideas matter. In some ways, that is the heart and soul of this research. How numbers lie, intersectional violence, and the quantification of race. The first part of this story opens with the ascent of the use of quantitative data to assess the demographic health and welfare of groups across the world. This is often commonly determined through literatures on the emergence of eugenics, the science of breeding better races, partly a consequence of the evolution of capitalism in Europe, also concerned about population control. But this is the age of science and reason. And out of that age of science and reason, statistics become a mainline instrument for assessing who's doing well and who's doing poorly in society. African Americans, as a group within a larger constellation of global populations moving hither and yon, emerge out of a specific moment having to do with the end or collapse of slavery in America as a result of the end of the Civil War in 1865. There's tremendous instability of thought about what these people are actually made of, and the very questions that turn on whether or not African Americans are endowed with the capacity to fully participate in a civilized society turns in part on the received wisdom of the past, having to do with anthropological assessments of Africa, having to do with religious ideas about multiple species of humanity, and perhaps more germane to this conversation, having to do with the physical or the constitutional makeup of African Americans or people of African descent. Haiti and Jamaica, for example, also get thrown in as historical examples of what happens when Black people are handed or force themselves into leadership of independent nations. All of these ideas, however, were hotly contested north and south, Black and white, regionally. And therefore, it wasn't until roughly the emergence of a US-based statistical reasoning that happens right about 1890s, and one of the progenitors of this idea, he was, for many white Americans, a kind of Ta-Nehisi Coates of popular writing for the Atlantic Monthly in the late 19th century. His name was Nathaniel Shaler. He also was a Harvard paleontologist and a very well-respected individual who contributed great bodies of knowledge, some of which had to do with some of the earliest writings calling for statistics to resolve these debates about who Black people were and what were they in fact capable of. So here we hear Shaler saying statistics will lead the way to a true understanding of Black people's true racial capacity. I often use the term bookmark to call your attention to holding on to an idea, because where we start is, as you can guess, where we will finish. But this ultimate idea that statistics will help us to solve these problems has been the governing idea of positivism or empiricism, particularly within the field of demographics and race since this time period. Just for illustrative purposes, Nathaniel Shaler was not alone. Richard Mayo Smith, who had the enviable job of actually establishing the discipline of statistical research, writing here for the Association for the Statistical Association of America, an article in 1893, Statistical Data for the Assimilation of Races and Nationalities. There is no origin story, no genealogy about the use of quantitative data to assess demographic groups that does not turn on race. So there's no point of recovery. This is not a point of departure. This is the foundation of how we come to think about demographics as a way of measuring communities. Fast forward to the future, and we're going to play with this back and forth. This is, in some ways, anathema to some of my historian colleagues. Might explain why I'm in the Kennedy School, but that's okay. But I want to make that visible, because part of the point of these ideas is to see the scaffolding, to see the constructions, and to make them visible to us. So we're all familiar with CompStat. It has been, for 20 years now, the most advanced technology using data and statistics to correlate criminal activity by neighborhood using spatial mapping software. William Bratton was among the first to deploy it under Rudolph Giuliani in the 1990s, and here we see Mayor Michael Bloomberg and Ray Kelly presiding over a CompStat meeting. Now, moving from CompStat to these incarceration rates, essentially you're seeing the artifacts of the way in which data has produced a social phenomenon. But at the same time, I want you to also be aware of the ways in which we are all prisoners or creatures of a way of thinking about how to govern ourselves in society, how to make decisions about what to do with, say, inequality or violence, for example. And so I see this mostly as an illustration in conversation with CompStat. These two are both policy implications, but they're also artifacts of the choices we've made. These are the long tails of those early ideas about statistics leading the way to the true racial capacity of a group. And so you know these numbers, they're familiar with you. Here we have tremendous racial disparity by race and ethnicity measured as recently as 2010. This comes from Prison Policy Initiative using Bureau of Justice statistics. Additionally, as is often the case, we talk a lot about the relationship of violent crime per capita in relationship to incarceration rates. And in some ways, the entire debate turns on whether or not the choice of individuals to engage in criminal activity or self-harm or the harm of others is directly related to those incarceration rates. That CompStat is a reflection of the behavior demonstrated in these crime charts. Part of the truth of these numbers, dare I say, is that they do measure things that are happening. They do measure some reflection of behavior on the ground. Why that behavior is happening, what we ought to do about it, is the conceit of this lecture. That the numbers don't, in fact, tell us or answer either of those questions. Never have and never will. And yet, most of us govern ourselves under the presumption that they speak loud and clear and lead to inevitable or inexorable conclusions. Stop and frisk, yet another signpost of the time, except for many people, particularly on the left, see these numbers as an absolute reflection of overzealous discriminatory policing. And indeed, many of those on the left were at least in the federal court given credence to their beliefs in a Floyd decision back in 2012 where there was recognition of discriminatory policing. My point here is not to adjudicate the case either way, except that these numbers clearly don't speak for themselves. They are subject to intense ideological debates about what, in fact, do they measure. And yet, when we have a conversation about them, I just want to expose our contemporary logic and reasoning so that you have a sense, perhaps, of how deeply held these notions are. In an interview with Meet the Press by David Gregory of Ray Kelly on the heels of his time as commissioner of New York Police Department, he was asked, is stop and frisk racial profiling? And here is his response. It doesn't mean that people are not doing anything wrong. If you look at the statute, it says reasonable suspicion that individuals may be about to commit a crime. There's a preventative aspect to this. People say innocent. That is not the appropriate word. This is the standard law enforcement practice around America. So the numbers, which are supposed to be artifacts of behavior and potentially policy choices about how to respond to that behavior, now also suggest a moral claim as to whether you can in fact be innocent, whether or not you've committed a crime or not. So you can see how we just build layers and layers of reasoning on top of some very fundamental things, whether or not there is a cold body laying on the street or whether or not there's a missing pot of cash. We add and add and add to those layers. Why do we do this? Well, according to Ray Kelly and the justification for this, it has something to do with our history. Now here I'm going to do a little bit of sleight of hand because it's not obvious that it has something to do with our reasoning. So I'll read what he says. We think the reasonable criteria, that is, to the question of whether to judge stop and frisk as racial profiling or not, is presented to us by the Rand Corporation, an institution that has been in existence for 100 years. Now, first you have to stop and ask yourself, this is Meet the Press, right? I mean, we're not at a conference. We're not talking amongst policy experts. We're talking to the American public. Do they really care about the Rand Corporation? So it's a gesture to authority, to expertise. So he says, to take a look at racial profiling, to determine if it happens, you should first look at the universe of people who are the perpetrators identified by the victims of violent crime. And in New York, that universe comports to the racial makeup of the people being stopped. Translation, that because black people victimize each other in their communities, the police response to that victimization in those communities can't, by definition, be either discriminatory or a form of racial profiling. That's the logic. Now, last I checked, the very constitutional basis as a matter of legal principle does not judge the fitness or behavior of groups, but for that inconvenient 3/5 clause that Annette can talk to us about during the Q&A, but judges people by their individuality. So this does in fact say to us that a social science research organization says it's okay as a matter of efficiency or as a matter of public safety, maybe not as a matter of constitutional principle, to discriminate against an entire group of people just because there may be criminal activity within the group. Now, it's obvious that, of course, all groups are more likely to commit harm against people they know and people just like them by our usual demographic categories. So some of this doesn't make sense either. Now, what does that translate to in terms of our usual political discourse? This is an exchange articulated by Mayor Giuliani in response to a critique mounted by Michael Dyson, also on Meet the Press 2 years later. This is in response to Ferguson and a conversation about the uprising then unfolding, and Giuliani gestures to this crime statistic. I find it very disappointing that you're not discussing the fact that 93% of blacks in America are killed by other blacks. I would like the attention paid to that. I call this the violence card in the way that some people refer to our discussions about race and racism in America as the race card, because it really is intended to end the conversation. In this sense, this is Rudolph Giuliani's way of saying the numbers speak for themselves. That by knowing that this is what black people do to each other, we need not have further conversation about any responsibility that lies outside of the black community. Well, it's an old yarn, as it turns out. And as I talk, I will increasingly reveal my own position on how to interpret these matters, but I leave it to you to decide for yourself. Ida B. Wells was one of the first activists and journalist scholars to use research and knowledge in the service of social transformation, particularly around the problem of sexual violence and racial violence more broadly. She happened to be sitting at a fancy dinner party where someone was remarking on the recent events that had unfolded in Atlanta, now known as the Atlanta Race Riot of 1906, which was, for shorthand purposes, a pogrom directed against the really middle to upper class black community, mostly situated in the area of the west side of Atlanta today, which houses the Atlanta University colleges, Spelman, Morehouse, Clark, etc. So the discourse around what caused white people to arm themselves and to attack wholesale the black community turned, as it turns out, even in a polite dinner party in Chicago, on the behavior of black people, their criminality that had elicited this response. Now think about contemporary forms of racial violence, whether George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, or the man who shot Jordan Davis, or various forms of state violence turning on loud music or gray hoodies. This notion that the inherent threat of danger posed by these African Americans who are not, by definition, innocent and who are menacing contributes to their premature death. And so the suffragist Mary Plummer, who was the wife of a wealthy corporate lawyer, George Plummer, in Chicago, responds to Ida B. Wells, who is objecting to what she's hearing, and she says, "I do not know what we can say," this is Plummer speaking, "about this terrible affair, but there is one thing I can say, and that is to urge all of you to drive the criminals out from among you. Have you forgotten," here's the gesture, "that 10% of all the crimes committed in Chicago last year were by colored men, less than 3% of the population?" Hence, playing the violence card. It's her trump card. This is not about what white people are doing, even in the South, in the height of the establishment and infrastructure of Jim Crow. Here is Ida B. Wells' 1892 publication, Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, where she turns to mainstream, largely white newspapers to document the actual record of what has caused race riots and lynchings directed mostly against black men, but occasionally against black women. And so she says, in doing her research, out of their mouths shall murderers be condemned. This is, in her way, a gesture to authority and expertise. She wants to essentially say that your own sources document that the propaganda and the justifications, the logic, the ideas, the ways in which the Mary Plumbers of the world are speaking to these issues is not even true in your own newspapers. What she discovers is that she's able to debunk the rape myth that only 31% of all black men accused of rape and subsequently lynched, because that was the set of data she was focused on, were even accused, or she says charged with rape. She also debunked the myth of black female licentiousness, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment, that this notion that black women themselves could not be raped is part of the discussion shifting the narrative or the inverting the racial narrative by reporting on white male rape of black women. What's fascinating about this moment is she precedes Du Bois and really precedes much of the official, or what I will call nationalizing discourse of these ideas as they become essentially a standard way of assessing how black people are doing. What are their communities like? Should you live there? Should they have full access to their mobility, whether it's in the North or the South? She tells the story of Pat Hanafan of Nashville, who outraged a little colored girl. Now here, the distinction for her is important. He was caught, he was not lynched, he served time in prison up to 6 months, and then he became a city detective. Now, because of the importance of this seminal moment, this origin story, the lines had not quite yet hardened. A lot of people were making these claims forcefully and reaching towards sources of authority precisely because they saw these as openings. And in this way, the fruits of Ida B. Wells' early efforts were expressed through the work of Nathaniel Shaler, the very man who opens our moment by giving voice to this importance of statistics. Also, on the eve of his death, he died in 1904, but roughly 10 years later, writes essentially that I'm inclined to believe that on the whole, there is less danger to be apprehended from them in this regard, that is, of rape by men against women, black women, from an equal body of whites of the like social grade. This was relatively treasonous in terms of how Southerners understood the relationship of lynchings to proof of black criminality. And as it filtered into a national discourse, most people were not interested in the footnotes or the asterisks in the way that Shaler here positioned it. What most people were interested in is a much more simple narrative that was articulated by one of the earliest progenitors of this nationalizing rhetoric, a man named Frederick Hoffman. Frederick Hoffman was the first to turn to census data in order to determine by demographic standards at the time, that the story of black people's true racial capacity was not to be told in the numbers of birth rates or mortality rates or morbidity rates based on disease incidence in the African American population. But in fact, the most compelling number was the number of African Americans in prison. As a result of that number, he says, the city Negro brought into direct competition with the white race has usually but one avenue out of his dilemma: the road to prison or to an early grave. Now, it'd be nice to say that the basic construct here, this notion that the evidence proves that black people will only land either in an incapacitated cage or die prematurely, we wish it weren't as resonant as it turns out to be even to this day. This is the number upon which Hoffman made this seminal claim. And there is really no national audience for this data or for the interpretation of the data before Hoffman does this as a result of the 1890 census. But it was because 12% of the population of African Americans were represented in the prison population across the North and the South, but mostly in the South, as 30% of the nation's prisoners. Just so that you believe me that this moment and the infrastructure upon which we sit today is still very much with us, here's a more recent quote. Back in 2008, Senator John Edwards, running in the early days before the news of his adulterous affair while his wife lay sick with cancer, put him out of the race. He said, when you have young African-American men who are completely convinced that they're either going to die or go to prison and see absolutely no hope in their lives, they don't see anything getting better. Now here he's gesturing to the statistics, which today are 40% versus 13%, fairly flat, I would argue, although some might be more concerned about 30% versus 40%. But I would say, given 120 years of history, we could see this as a fairly flat proportion of the problem. And if you listen to Hoffman carefully in the quote, the city Negro only has but one avenue out of his dilemma, he's not actually prescribing racist responses to it. Not yet, at least. Not in the statement alone. Not in the way that John Edwards really intends for us. This is a calling card for us to respond. But you see that the number doesn't tell us what to do. The 30 versus 12% didn't tell us any more than that it was an artifact of what? The political economy of punishment in the Jim Crow South? The establishment and reach of convict leasing and chain gangs to suppress the economic and political mobility of black people at the dawn of freedom? Do we even know how many people were, in fact, criminals by some standard that we might all agree on today, looking back on that time period? I like to evoke here Stephen Gould's Mismeasure of Man, which was incredibly influential to me as an early graduate student, because the search for G, that coefficient of genius, sent a lot of people into a tailspin, trying to prove the point that you could correlate innate intelligence by racial categories. And he debunked those myths time and time again, showing over time that people failed repeatedly. Well, in many ways, it's really not worth our time to try to have a conversation about how many of those 30% are in fact criminals that get what they deserved, any more than it is worth our time today trying to figure out what portion of those 40% are criminals who get what they deserve. But there are probably a lot of graduate students here and elsewhere who are doing exactly that. I'm interested in the currency of such figures. I'm interested in the long tail of such figures as being able to simplify complex reality that govern the choices that we make and the way that we actually live our lives. And so here are illustrative examples, and I'm going to move back and forth between competing definitions of how we should interpret these statistics. Take this as one example. Here we have a proudly racist governor. He was a white supremacist governor. He felt that black people had no place in the governance or political economy of the state of Mississippi, and he did not mince his words. One of the benefits of that day, maybe those benefits are returning in this day and age. Nevertheless, he also reached for authority, for expertise, and so where does he look for? He says, And I'll give you a little context for this. This is a debate where it turns out you could track basically that there were disproportionately more criminals in the North than in the South. And you could track school attendance in the North versus the South. And of course, when you're a social scientist and you need something smart to say, you correlate those two things and essentially come up with the answer that, oh, the more educational opportunities we extend to black people, the more criminal they are. So he says, to school the Negro is to increase his criminality. Official statistics do not lie. And they tell us that the Negroes who can read and write are more criminal than the illiterate. In New England, where they are best educated, they are 4.5 times as criminals as in the Black Belt, where they are most ignorant. The more money for Negro education, the more Negro crime. This is the unmistakable showing of the United States Census. I'm going to resist using Trump's name again, but you could imagine that such logic would be articulated if he were engaged in the same sources of information. Now, fortunately, much of this discourse in its earliest days was met with resistance and response. Just as Ida B. Wells was responding to the rape myth, so too did one of Howard University's earliest black sociologists, a man named Kelly Miller. He responded directly to the allegation that the census data proved, because of the North-South divide and the greater access to educational opportunity, that black people were turned into criminals because of their education. He says, where legal processes are acknowledged to be fair and where the Negro has the fullest educational opportunity, he shows a criminal rate 3 to 4 times as great as his ignorant and oppressed brother in the South. And the conclusion is hastily reached that education makes the Negro a criminal. Okay. Here's his proof. He says that black men are 5 times more likely in Massachusetts to serve time than in Mississippi. Okay. If you're on the left, you might be disturbed by that. If you're on the right, you might say, aha, see, that's the point. Turns out white men were 10 times overrepresented in Massachusetts in terms of their prison rates than in Mississippi. Now, I'm sure if I poll the audience, some Harvard brilliance will issue forth, and someone will point out that the bureaucracies and agencies of the criminal justice system were far more sophisticated here in Massachusetts, with its very old colonial communities of or carceral archipelago, essentially, and at the same time, population density and a more urbane population dictated the norms of most criminal justice activity, even in that day. So Kelly Miller asked the question, did education make northern whites criminal too? And his answer, or shall we foster the bliss of ignorance only when it is found under a black skin? So this back and forth is really, the statistical game of interpretation is foundational in the same way that Michael Eric Dyson responds to Rudolph Giuliani saying, and 84% of all homicides among whites are by other whites. They're just going back and forth. One of the vocal socialist and progressive Labor Party members, a man named Harry Ruhlman, also introduces us to another thread of ideas that are ascendant at this time period. So we've talked about the racialization of crime as it pertains to black people, but we start to hear the de-racialization of crime as it pertains to European immigrants and poor whites. The project of decriminalization, as it turns out, also depends on statistical interpretations. In other words, the numbers are just the starting point for a practice of ideological preference and policy advocacy, and in this case, the reverse is true. The whole problem of crime, as today expressed in society, is summed up in the problem of poverty. We have churches enough, schools enough, moral sentiment enough to regenerate the world in a decade, were it not for the awful pressure brought to bear on 9/10 of the human race, which all but forces them to be vicious. Now, I'll just gesture here to part of my work as a progressive era historian, and that is much of the history of the progressive era has been written as a northern white story of native whites and European immigrants, and then in the South, a story of whites and blacks. there's not a lot. There is some, but not as much as there should be, of the understanding of the relationship of the progressive era as experienced by black people who were there. And so in this case, here we have the voice of the vast majority of people who are the focus and target of social reformers and criminal justice officials who happen to be white or of European ancestry. And it turns out that an increasingly vocal argument in favor of what to do with them is to interpret the crime statistics as symptomatic of class inequality. This is what Bernie Sanders would sound like if he were around in 1895. Frederick Hoffman, the same person who invented, or I should say, led the way towards a nationalizing discourse of racial criminalization, also had progressive leanings when it came to interpreting the criminality of whites. Here he says in an extended quote, "The study of statistics of suicide, madness, and crime is one of the utmost importance to any society. When such an increase has been proved to exist, it is the duty of society to leave nothing undone until the evil has been checked or been brought under control. The health of the people must come before the wealth of the people. We must be far from truly civilized as long as we permit to exist or accept as inevitable conditions which year after year drive an increasing army of unfortunates to madness, crime, or suicide. It is the struggle of the classes, of the masses against the classes." When he spoke of crime statistics for African Americans 4 years later in a seminal work, Race, Traits, and Tendencies, he said prison statistics from all over the place, from Chicago to Jersey to Charleston, South Carolina, confirm the census data and show without exception that the criminality of the Negro exceeds that of any other race of any numerical importance in this country. We'll stop there. So just pause. That's a fact. There's no disputing the fact. And you have to understand the difference. We can all look at the latest data of people who are in prison. We can look at the arrest data. That data is made up. The data is not lying. But what does the data tell us has happened, or why it has happened, or what we should do about it is where the lying begins. And so now Hoffman is going to tell us how to interpret it, even though he was very fond of reflecting on his foreign birth. He was German, and that he was very committed to a very unbiased observation. He was, in his mind, the Alexis de Tocqueville of the late 20th century on race. He says, when the Negro learns to respect life, property, and chastity until he learns to believe in the value of a personal morality operating in his daily life, the criminal tendencies will increase. So here we have a gesture towards how do we fix it, quite at odds with a notion of this being a reflection of class inequality or industrialization's strain on everyday people who are turning to self-harm and the harm of others. He then goes on to extend the notion, I have given the statistics of the general progress of the race and religion and education for the country at large and have shown that in church and school, the number of attending members or pupils, this is what statistical regression looks like before we have statistical regression. So rather than coefficients for church and school factored in to isolate the independent variable, the notion here is that using descriptive data, I can show that black people have greater and greater access to school and to moral training, and their crime statistics are going through the roof. Therefore, we can isolate that it's them and not the structures of opportunity that are surrounding them. And says, ultimately, but in the statistics of crime and the data of illegitimacy, now marrying essentially the extended tropes of black women's licentiousness and sexual depravity with the male-centric idea of criminality as proof that neither religion nor education has influenced to an appreciable degree the moral progress of the race. This at the height of the codification of Jim Crow segregation in America, the same year that Plessy versus Ferguson was formed, ultimately positions this criminality discourse at the heart of a nationalizing project that essentially cosigns on premature death and cosigns on nationalized explicit discrimination. Now, it will take de facto forms in the North, but the underlying rationale that black communities ought to be treated differently is articulated here. And we ought to think twice about how much to invest in their opportunity structures. Now, to make the point and to show you, rather than just to simply say that they had different ideas about what to do with our Irish and Italian cousins, turns out that Frederick Bushy did a groundbreaking study called Ethnic Factors in the Population of Boston, published in 1903. He noted that the Irish had the highest rates of petty crime and the Italians topped the list for major felonies. Quote, there is moral degradation among Irish families as a result of drink, which is not found among other nationalities, for quarrels, which are serious affairs, for flashes of anger, which mean a knife thrust. One must go to the Italian quarters. Hoffman himself agreed. The Irish and Italians show a percentage of arrests decidedly above the average, but here's the kicker, yet small when compared with that of the colored element. So part of the statistical sophistry that's going on here is a call for an intervention on one hand, a call for neglect on the other, and the neglect being predicated on somehow the racial disparity being so excessive that it's proof of the underlying moral degeneracy of the entire group. Instead, our Irish and Italians were labeled Americans in process. And as Americans in process, they just needed more time to work things out. Another Harvard economist named William Ripley said they were fellow passengers on our ship of state who simply needed to be nurtured through playgrounds and public recreation, through all sorts of reforms that would be pro-social interventions into their communities. And that begins to look like the progressive era. Just so that you don't think I'm hiding from African Americans, some of whom participated for various reasons, sometimes because their class positions compelled them to denigrate their social inferiors, sometimes because they truly fundamentally believed that there was something wrong with black people and they just happened to be the exception that proved the rule. In this case, William Hannibal Thomas wrote a book called The American Negro in 1901, occurring right in the midst of this nationalizing debate of which he himself is responding to. And in his tirade of black traits, and here's just a highlight, he calls blacks savage at heart. He refers to them as unable practically to discern between right and wrong. They are intrinsically inferior type of humanity, a record of lawless existence led by every impulse and passion. Really, the inferiority of the Negro in mind, morals, judgment, and character is such that there is no doubt that some very plausible confirmatory evidence of the justness of the simian theory of human origin might be derived from a close inspection of his demeanor. I'm at Harvard, so I don't need to explain what he's saying. But those are fighting words. But here's the part of it that I think is revealing. They should have been roundly dismissed by the standards that he brought to the table. He was not a sociologist. He had not been trained as a sociologist. He had been a Reconstruction-era judge during the Reconstruction period from Ohio who had kind of a panopticon view of what was going on in the South. And so that he walked away with these strongly held positions gave him some credibility on the subject, but not by the standards of the social sciences gesturing towards statistics. And yet, Franklin Giddings, founder of Columbia University Sociology Department and the third president of the American Sociological Association, says this in his unpublished manuscript review of Thomas's manuscript. This is what gets it published. As a sociological study, it is one of the most valuable things to be put in the hands of genuine students of American conditions that I know of. Presents his subject without an atom of the sentimentality which has so often proved a blemish in many books otherwise most excellent. I can think of a few people more recently who've been accused of sentimentality when writing in defense of or as a critique of racism in American society. So, therefore, even the justification to publish Hannibal Thomas's text is because it is sitting within an ideological context that doesn't really depend on data or its authenticity. Here is the illustration that brings you all here, curious and wondering what was this illustration all about. It comes to us as a result of Newberry Library in Chicago. It is the annual report of the Central Howard Association. What was the Central Howard Association? It was a prisoner reentry organization. Their focus was on trying to get men back home so that they could reconstitute families for the purposes of economic and social mobility. This was a standard way of fundraising and reporting back to fundraisers what direct social service organizations like settlement houses were doing. This is the on-the-ground response to the notion that the criminality was symptomatic of class inequality and that we needed to do something about it until the evil had been checked. Now, I will tone down the way that I often narrate this illustration tonight, but it's really fascinating to see, in part because it is an image of what we might consider an all-white slum or an inner-city white ghetto of the early 20th century. Here we have potentially a single mother. It's not exactly clear, but she's certainly by herself with a lot of babies. Now, in the long discourse of the data of illegitimacy of black women and their sexual depravity and incapacity to keep their legs closed, this is a presentation of white womanhood with too many babies. And the intended consequence of that is they are potentially juvenile delinquencies, they live in a bad neighborhood. It has all the markings of the relationship of poverty to moral worth and undesirability. How do we know it's a poor neighborhood? She's missing shingles from the home. She does a degraded occupation as a washerwoman. And every bad neighborhood from that moment to this moment comes with an abusive police officer at the end of the street. And there he is carting away a protesting person. Additionally, bad neighborhoods usually have bars, at least not the ones that have been gentrified. And so there in the background in the top left says saloon. We could stop there and see the face of criminality of the Irish or the Italians, of Jewish immigrants that all these people are talking about. But what are we to make of it? How criminals are made? So long as there are bad tenements, sweatshops, brutal policemen, bad jails, child labor, dishonest and grinding employers, saloons and gambling dens, so long as boys are taught to fight and allowed to carry firearms, so long as fathers are indifferent deserters and mothers must maintain the family by the washboard, so long crime will continue. What will you do to help this association to prevent it? No correlation of access to churches or to schools, or the association that the criminality is something they have to deal with before anyone can intervene on their behalf. This is a progressive era, robust response to saving these communities from themselves. Jane Addams was the archetypal social worker who spearheaded a national movement and helped to provide cover, fundraising, and foundation to the universe of settlement houses and other direct service agencies like the Central Howard Association, of which we've just looked at. What I want you to see here is this is what sentimentality looks like when middle-class and elite white women are working on behalf of the poor, many of whom don't speak English or the native language of which these women oftentimes represented as Americans. In other words, they had no more in common with these women and their families than their African-American counterparts, except some broad notion of European ancestry. But weren't these women Americans just like their multi-generation black counterparts from the South? And so I leave it to you to figure out who they had more allegiances to. But essentially, they narrated the problem of 15,000 young people brought before Chicago's juvenile court in 1904 in The Spirit of Youth in City Streets by Jane Addams. She described how these young people stole from their parents, swiped junk, pawned their clothes and shoes, did any desperate thing to get the dope, as they called it. Talked about a Polish youth shooting an Irish boy in the head and said this tale could be duplicated almost every morning. What might be merely a boyish scrap is turned into a tragedy because some boy has a revolver. And then, this is the part that I think is even really revealing. She says, we certainly cannot expect the fathers and mothers who have come to the city from farms or who have immigrated from other lands to appreciate or rectify these dangers, nor could we expect the young people themselves to kill the cancer of modern city conditions. So there's no discourse of personal responsibility. This is not about learning to respect other people's property. This is not about chastity or morality. This is about context and structural barriers baked into a response to the crime statistics which were symptomatic of class inequality, as these progressives kept telling us. She goes on to talk about prostitution and tells this story of a young girl who is described here saying, I just had to go to dances sometime after pushing down the lever of my machine with my right foot and using both my arms, feeding it for 10 hours a day. This is the sentimental narration of the experience that leads people down lives of sexual or moral degradation as well as criminality. The parting ended when a sympathetic man befriended her only to try to steer her into prostitution. Of course, I threatened to kill him, she told Adams. Any decent girl would, and this is a way of showing their humanity, their resistance in the wake of industrial grinding. Jane Addams writes in one of the earliest issues of Crisis magazine. She was a co-founder along with many others, including socialists like William Walling and Du Bois. She writes in the third issue of Crisis magazine in response to the problem of the lack of inherited control in the black community. She says, one could easily illustrate this lack of inherited control by comparing the experiences of a group of colored girls with those of a group representing the daughters of Italian immigrants or of any other Southern European peoples. The Italian girls very much enjoy the novelty of factory work, the opportunity to earn money and to dress as Americans do. But this new freedom of theirs is carefully guarded. In the same book, and she talks about, in the previous discussion, she talks about parents can't control this. Factory work is degrading. These girls are vulnerable by virtue of having to leave the house in the first place to contribute to the household, to being steered into lives of prostitution. So we have to ask ourselves, why would she say something to an audience of black readers dealing with the problem of the segregated experiences of black people, girls in particular? But for this notion that somehow the possibilities of prostitution for the black community did germinate somewhere beyond the larger industrial crisis, that there was still something inside of black people that was that G, that special coefficient of inferiority that needed to be addressed before they could be pushed into a larger project of progressive era intervention. Just so you don't think I made it up, when her work was reviewed in the American Journal of Sociology, it was noted sociology has published a classic. So exquisitely and poetically has Miss Addams revealed the precious stuff of which young hearts are made, that we gladly give her book a place beside Wordsworth's great ode. By contrast to Franklin Giddings praising William Hannibal Thomas for a racist screed against black people, because he didn't show a blemish of sentimentality. So almost everywhere we look, we see, I'm calling them lies because they are not a reflection of anything factual or empirical or positivist. They are people's interpretation of what's happening in society. Frances Keller emerges on the scene also as one of essentially the first female American criminologists. She is a badass by the standards of that day. And partly a badass because she publishes some of the earliest studies turning to resolve or end the question of whether you could locate criminality in the body. And so she does literally some of the first Tuskegee experiments comparing black women at Tuskegee with northern women in college to measure mostly their memory, because she sees their capacity to remember things as a reflection of their brain power. And she finds that there's no difference. She also compares black women in prison in the South to white women in prison in the South. After she does a battery of tests, she comes to the conclusion that there is no physical evidence that black people are inferior to white people in constitution or their mental capacity. She also says, or she says here, it is impossible to estimate the persistency of racial traits or the limitations, mental or physical, imposed by the racial development until a parallel environment is removed. So she's shifting the gaze from body to community. And that is, the environment must be shown to be of such a nature that it offers every opportunity for development and improvement. In no phase of the Negro's life, domestic, social, industrial, political, or religious, does this appear to be the case. This is a big deal. It's a really big deal. Now that she happens to be the first female criminologist, she doesn't get much traction with this idea. But the idea basically here is to say black people don't have equal conditions of life. And therefore, we can't turn to their crime statistics as a measure of what they're capable of until we, quote unquote, create a parallel environment. Yet, even here, she turns on black women's behavior as some, again, coefficient, some residue, something extra that suggests that they themselves are not fully prepared for the full fruits of freedom. She said they left their happy-go-lucky, cheerful life in the South. Now, really? As migrants, only to end up drifting into immorality. Now, talk about passive voice here. They just simply leave the South and now they're prostitutes. They often had the best of intentions, but partly due to their, quote, ignorance, their inflated ambitions. Think about that. Because part of knowing your place in this time period is knowing what to reach for. And choosing not to reach for your place also means in the South landing on a convict lease or in a chain gang, and in the North being surveyed or racially quarantined. To them, going to Philadelphia or New York seemed like going to heaven. How dare they think such things? Mary White Ovington also wrote essentially the second major study of the Black urban experience as a sequel to Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro, published in 1911. When she turns to the experiences of Black women, she says, a very large percentage of crime among colored women, unduly large percentage of disorderly, depraved colored. I'm sorry, that's a little choppy there. She then goes on to excuse Black men's criminality was no higher than could be expected, because she's much more interested in a book called Half a Man on understanding that Black men faced barriers to their economic participation, and she did believe that that contributed to their criminality in the same way that Frances Keller was beginning to talk about structure. But depravity among the girls and improper guardianship, the girls and their mothers, were the race's most serious defects. So this is what the intersectional violence looks like in the progressive era, which then turns on what the race is capable of because of its defective daughters and mothers. Du Bois weighed in also. That resistance was always around the corner. He talked about the unscientific use of the statistical method in response to Hoffman. He pointed out in the acerbic way that Du Bois often did that German cities, Montreal, Naples, Belfast, Budapest, Breslau, and Madrid all have shown within a few years death rates equal to American Negroes in cities, as if to completely upend, as Ida B. Wells had once done, the notion that you couldn't correlate the evidence of premature death with the racial capacity of groups. Because if you could, then were Europe's races becoming extinct? He talked about illegitimacy rates in Rome, Munich, Stockholm, Paris, Brussels, as being higher than Negroes in Washington, D.C., to call fundamentally into question the lie or the interpretation or the ideology at play. What happened to Bushy's Italian and Irish criminals? So I like to ask it another way. How many Italian Americans committed armed robbery last quarter? How about Irish American burglars? Does anyone know? You don't know any more than you know how many police shootings there were in police departments. Because at some point we decided that this was not useful data. And the moment that we decided it was the moment when social scientist Edward Sutherland, the first canonized American criminologist, who wrote several editions of the book Principles of Criminology, noted that the second generation of immigrants appears to approach the native-born of native parentage in regard to the kinds of crime committed. Translation, well, they're just like white people, therefore we don't need to know anything specific about Italian Americans and Irish Americans. This is decriminalization. So whereas we've seen nothing but continued racial criminalization of blacks, we are seeing both in the policy response to poverty in white and immigrant communities a mechanism for decriminalizing. We've seen a literary trope of sentimentality directed towards these groups as young kids getting caught up in the spirit of urban adventure, and the tragedy is on us. And now we begin to see the disappearance of the statistical gaze that had been born in the eugenics era across the 19th century to prove that certain groups were inferior and should no longer be supported. This was also part of the social Darwinist argument that it was an inefficient use of resources to prop up inferior groups. The Unified Crime Reports, we should not be surprised, then begins in 1930, and by 1933, is able to say that it is believed that figures pertaining to the number of Negroes and foreign-born whites who were arrested and fingerprinted can most fairly be presented by showing them in proportion to the number of such individuals in the general population. This is essentially the fermentation and foundation for how we use crime statistics to this day. This is the most authoritative evidence of local criminal activity by arrest data across the nation, beginning in this moment. There's a backstory to that. I'm not here to tell you that story. But guess what happens fairly quickly between 1933 and 1940? Notice it says, it is significant to point out that the figure for native whites includes the immediate descendants of foreign-born individuals. Hence, what happened to Bushy's Italians and Irish is that they became white, they disappeared, and so too did their criminality, leaving blackness as the dominant and primary measure of statistical deviation and behavioral deviance in American society, because it always still captured as an artifact the fundamental inequality that existed in American society. And that's where we are today, ladies and gentlemen. I'll just mention here, Charles S. Johnson, leading black sociologist, pointed out that there was bias in the system because when they studied it and asked white criminal justice officials in Chicago in the wake of a major race riot, they admitted to it. They said, yes, we police black communities differently. As a result of that, the Chicago Commission on Race Relations considered it best to avoid giving currency to figures which carried such clear evidence of their own inaccuracy and misrepresentation. But it didn't matter to the uniform crime reports. So here again, you see the resistance. We had choices. We could have chosen differently. We might not have lied, but as a set of policy choices, we continue to do so. In the Department of Justice Ferguson report, we shouldn't be surprised then, coming up to more recent history, that city officials have frequently asserted that the harsh and disparate results of Ferguson law enforcement system, this is according to the officials in Ferguson, do not indicate problems with police or court practices, but instead reflect a pervasive lack of personal responsibility among certain segments of the community. If we gave them the most generous reading possible for their explanation, it's still not obvious that they should have been using dogs on children or surveying the community for the purposes of generating revenue, that they might have responded like progressives, that they might have taken the evidence of a lack of personal responsibility among certain segments of the community as a robust opportunity to engage in that community with pro-social interventions. But once we baked in these layers of saying from the very beginning that you don't treat black people the way you treat white people even when they're criminals, or that there's criminality in their community, as Ray Kelly reminded us, then we shouldn't be surprised at the harvest or the outcome. FBI Director James Comey tells us that our greatest challenge in a speech he gave last year, the greatest challenge is to grow drug resistance and violence resistance kids. How are we going to do that? The first step to understanding what is really going on in our communities and in our country is to gather more and better data related to those we arrest, those we confront breaking the law and jeopardizing public safety, and those who confront us. Data seems a dry and boring word, but without it, we cannot understand our world and make it better. It's a little depressing, I know, but I leave it to you to figure out. Responding to Black Lives Matter, it's because blacks commit murder 8 times more capita than any other group in our society. And when I assigned police officers with Commissioner William Braden, we did it based on statistics. We didn't do it based on race. If there were a lot of murders in a community, we put a lot of police officers there. Remember how criminals are made? Maybe it's just they don't know. Our historical memory is so corrupted that if they just knew better, they do differently. Frankly, that's what I'm holding on to. Finally, the New York Times, I saw it yesterday, published on February 22nd. Why are white death rates rising? And I read this, I pulled out a few quotes, but here we are back again, almost full circle, 100 years later. In our global capital moment of an information age, we are seeing yet again the ravages of the industrial economy the post-industrial economy of the information age take hold of white communities across America. Both studies attributed the higher death rates to increases in poisonings and chronic liver disease, which mainly reflect drug overdoses and alcohol abuse, and to suicides, not unlike Frederick Hoffman talked about the health of the people. A 35-year-old white man who did construction jobs said, "It's much harder for me as a grown man than it was for my father." Already we're in that sentimental space, the pathos of what's happening to white Americans. And then here, evoking a version of Robert Merton's strain theory, we have a gesture to the failed expectations of people expecting more out of life, but meeting structural barriers at every turn. Reference group theory here noted at the bottom explains why people who have more may feel that they have less. What matters is to whom you are comparing yourself. It's not that white workers aren't doing worse than African Americans or Hispanics. It's that they think they're doing worse than their parents' generation, and I should have included that. So I'm going to leave you at the end of my talk with the question to you that we can hopefully engage in Q&A is, do numbers lie? Because the issue is not that we can't use data in order to discover and describe the communities, the world in which we live, but that won't help us figure out what to do about it. And oftentimes does just the opposite, serves as a shorthand reference for what we want to do about it, which in this case has been to do intersectional violence to Black people since the 1890s. Thank you very much.